Hi, welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Dr. Jim Calvert. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and university teaching professor. And the topic for today is going to be on evil and what is it that makes people become evil. I teach a course called Psychology of Evil. And in that course, what we do is we look at a wide variety of evil behaviors and evil people. In some cases, what we're looking at are things like serial killers, torturers, rapists. In other cases, we're looking at, corporate CEOs and politicians who have done things like embezzle or con people out of their money or do other kinds of evil behaviors that we don't always think of as specifically evil because most people think of serial killers when they think of evil. We try to look at the whole range of things. And in fact, in the class, one of the things that I always do is to try to define evil for them. And we find out throughout the entire course that it's not that easy to define what evil is. Some people consider things like euthanasia to be evil, while others say that's not evil at all. Some people say, well, if you ghost somebody, that's not evil. In class, a lot of people, my students will say, well, if you ghost them after the very first time you go out with them, it's no big deal. But if you've been dating them for months and months, and then it becomes more evil. So what is evil and exactly how severe does the behavior need to be evil? Again, some places and in some religions, certain kinds of sexual orientations of evil, while other people consider that to be not evil at all. So that's one of the things that we're looking at is what is it that makes people evil? But we're predominantly focusing on things like, murder, torture, sexual abuse, anything that has to do with the more severe forms of evil that most everybody considers to be evil. But again, we do toss in when we're talking about the class and we're getting our own evildoers, which I'll explain to you in just a minute, about people who con and people who, manipulate others and harm others in other ways that are not directly like physical harm on the person. What I do in the course is that I give everybody an evildoer. So they may get an evildoer like, Ted Bundy. They may get an evildoer like, a CEO or a politician. And they then go back and they study that particular evildoer in depth to tell us a little bit about why did that evildoer become evil? What was happening to them? Now, there are some limits to that because we can, A, only use people who are famous, and B, we can really only know things about their behavior and what others report and what was happening to them. We often don't have a lot of information about things like what happened to them when they were born. Is there a genetic predisposition? Because nobody ever did any genetic testing on them. So we don't have that kind of information. But what we do have is what happened to them as a child, what was going on when they were growing up, what were events that were happening in the community or in society around them. We have the ability to look at a lot of those things. So what I have all the students do is after they have evaluated their evildoers, they send me their top 5 reasons they think that that person became evil. What was it about the person? Personality characteristics, things that happened to them. What was going on that made it so that those people became evil? And so what we then did was we put all of that together. And over the last 6 years, we've done over 300 evildoers. And I've taken those and put them all together and come up with the top 10. So these are the top 10 things that or issues involved with the people who do evil. So let's take ourselves through that. We're going to look at the top 10. We're going to look at some caveats to that, just so we get a better idea about what is it. Most of my students are really surprised to find out that a lot of these people don't seem to be just born evil. There's not just this evil aura around them, but things happen to them. In fact, even those that there's probably a good chance that they came from some genetic underpinnings to evil, that they often had to have a lot of things happening to them, things going on around them in their world, disappointments that happened to them, onslaught. Sometimes there was brain injury. Sometimes it was substance abuse. Sometimes it was, just a general, the family themselves were disparate. There was divorce in the family, things that happened to them. And so we took a look at all of those kind of things. And so this is going to be the top 10 for that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share with you the PowerPoint so you can see what the top 10 issues are with our evildoers and what we're looking at in our class, which we call Psychology of Evil. Now, number one is let's look at the caveat to this. Remember that I've already mentioned it before. These characteristics, traits, any physical problems, environmental influences, anything else about each person are the things that we know and that we could identify with them. So again, there are a lot of things that may be going on. For example, we don't know if these people are born with a small amygdala or underactive amygdala, which we see a lot in people who have been identified as psychopaths. In other words, they have a certain neurological problem, but we don't have a lot of that information about these people because A, we don't have any genetic testing on them, and most of the times they don't have any brain scans that were done. We catch these people after they've done something evil, and then we have to go back and figure out what was kind of the patterns of behavior. So keep that in mind as we go through this. We don't know certain genetic things, and while we may know that there were some head injuries or other neurological deficits, perhaps some learning deficits and things like that, we don't specifically know about, factors like do they have a thin cortex? Do they have an underactive amygdala or other kinds of issues that may be happening for these evildoers? Here's our second caveat to this. Remember that we looked at psychopathic CEOs. In fact, there's good evidence to indicate that CEOs have a pretty high rate of psychopathy. In other words, some traits of psychopathy are, valued. In other words, going for it, just getting out there and, not procrastinating, making the decisions quickly, not being that concerned about how it hurts other people because it's better for the bottom line. Those kinds of things are often rewarded in our society. So we see a pretty high level of CEOs who have psychopathy as, if not a true disorder, a large number of symptoms of it. Okay. We also know that a lot of our politicians, same kinds of issues with them. What we find cropping up with them is a lot of narcissism, and we'll notice that that will pop up later on and it'll come up in our top 10 because we see more of that with our CEOs and our evil politicians that we study than we do with some of the other issues like head injuries that we might see or low IQ. So, for example, individuals with low IQ who are also somewhat aggressive in their general approach to life, those are more likely to be caught and put in jail because they do things like, get in bar fights or kill somebody, and then they're put in jail. Well, the CEOs who may be higher IQ and they don't have the general aggression, but they do have the, wherewithal and want to maybe con people or, get whatever they want by any means necessary, the old Machiavellianism. So keep that in mind as we're going through that the higher intellectual functioning, higher cognitive functioning overall often will do things like, con you, do Ponzi schemes, things like that to take your money and to manipulate you, and not likely to be as likely to kill you. So we're looking at that whole range. And everything on this top 10 includes, again, everything from CEOs and politicians who are evil to people who are serial killers. We do have more serial killers. We do have more cult leaders who then harmed other people within their cult. We do have more of those people within our group of, a little over 300 evildoers. So it definitely leans that direction. And keep that in mind as we're going through our top 10. So these are our dishonorable mentions. Our dishonorable mentions meaning they didn't make the top 10, but they continually pop up and so if we did a top 20, obviously these people would fall within that. So one of them is religious extremism. We find that that's not uncommon, especially among cult leaders. And we study a number of different cult leaders like, Jim Jones. And so that religious extremism, where they will especially put themselves in a position where they are a higher order person, that you need to revere them, maybe even worship them. those kinds of things, we see that. Delinquent peers, it didn't make it into the top, but it's a really common issue among children with conduct disorder. In fact, it's one of the better predictors of if you have conduct disorder. Is that conduct disorder going to continue into adolescence? Is it going to continue into adulthood if you have delinquent peers, those other people around you who also have these conduct problems? Okay. Lack of supervision as a child, meaning that nobody was there to watch over that child. That child was often, going it alone, making their own decisions. The parents were often absent. And we do know that as we go through this, we'll talk a fair amount about how parents being absent and the more disruptive that it is within the family, the more likely we are to have evil behavior come out of that. Another one is enabled or felt privileged as a child. This was much more likely to be something that we saw among those who were the evil CEOs or evil politicians. In other words, they were given a break constantly. They were able to get away with things that the typical person probably could not get away with. Money and greed, that underlies a lot of evil. And you've probably heard that the love of money is leads to evil behavior, and it does indeed. So one of the things we find consistently, especially those who are conning others, whether it's a Ponzi scheme or whatever that happens to be, that plays a huge role, even sometimes in our killings, where we, want something out of it. We want money. We want to get something back from it in that way. Low IQ or learning deficits is another one that we see. And again, it didn't make it into our top 10, but it makes it much more likely that these people are going to get involved, especially in those kinds of things where they've harmed somebody. If they have low IQ, they have some sort of learning deficits that may also signal us that there's possibly some sort of neurodevelopmental problem that's happening. So there may be something early on that's going on, making it so that they are perhaps have less frustration tolerance, but it also may signal that they don't make very good decisions. So they can become impulsive and do things that are potentially quite dangerous to other people, which leads to, again, them engaging in some sort of evil behavior. So let's start off with our top 10. Number 10, conduct disorder as a child. So what we found is that a lot of these evildoers, they started early. And in fact, the conduct disorder as a child was much more likely to be truly childhood rather than adolescent onset. This is pretty consistent, and a lot of research supports this. That if you have conduct disorder as a child, so you're doing things like harming animals, you are, violating the rights of other people, you are, abusing other people, sometimes getting in fights as a child, blaming other people, running away from home, stealing, any of these kinds of things that all go together to mean conduct disorder as a child, clearly very predictive of later on evil behavior. Number 9, sexual deviancy or paraphilias. These crop up a whole lot. The major sexual deviancy is a tendency towards sadism, meaning that you're wanting to inflict pain on another person and enjoying that. But there's a wide range of other paraphilias that fall within this. So paraphilias are, things such as, again, pedophilia can fall under this, so more likely to want to, abuse a child. Other things that can fall under this are like frauderism or voyeurism. So these kinds of other paraphilias can all play a big role. And if you're noticing these, they happen a lot. In fact, a lot of the evil ends up being this kinds of some form of sexual abuse on someone. And obviously, pedophilia, by its very nature, is an evil behavior. And so, not surprising that this would fall into one of our top 10 issues that's going on. They're showing that behavior and typically showing it fairly early on. Number 8, the social climate or culture. So in this case, this has to do with what's going on around you, what's happening in your community, in other words, a more violent community, making it more likely. But it also has to do with social climate and what's happening. In other words, are we likely to look the other way as a society on things? And you'll find that this will come into play a lot, for example, with some of our evil politicians, where they're more likely to, sometimes they help to set the social climate, but oftentimes they just benefit from that social climate. The one that we is easy to go back to, obviously, is Hitler and look at what's going on there in Germany and how he was able to capitalize on the social climate that was going on. But we see that to be true not only in those cases, but in a large variety of other situations as well. Number seven, mental health problems. So what they're noticing is that it's not just the evildoers aren't just evil because they're doing evil things. They themselves have a large number of mental health, diagnosable mental health problems outside of just things like antisocial personality or psychopathy or anything like that. So what we're really looking at here is mental health problems that can be depression, it can be psychosis, it can be severe anxieties. You'll find that what crops up a lot is severe depression, feeling horrible about themselves, and one of the ways that they then lash out at other is to literally lash out at other people. Um, uh, Psychotic reactions like schizophrenia can sometimes cause to have bizarre ideations, delusions about what's going on about people, maybe people out to get them and they need to harm the people before they do it. So we'll find kind of a range of that. You'll find some other mental health problems kind of crop up in there that make it more likely. So for example, ADHD. It doesn't mean that ADHD is more likely to lead to evil behavior. What it does is it increases the likelihood of impulsivity. You'll see that in mania and bipolar disorder as well. So that just increases the likelihood of making a decision without really thinking well about it. Okay. Oh, yeah. And again, this is just to make sure we are excluding all personality disorders in this. So this number seven is not including, as I just mentioned, antisocial personality disorder. It is not including things like borderline personality disorder. This does not include those. It's excluding those. It's looking at other clinical mental health problems like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other related types of disorders. Number six, substance abuse. Pretty common to have substance abuse be a part of this. And so this ranges from, alcohol use to a variety of drug use. Alcohol being the most common. It's the most common of all of our abuses. It's, of course, easily accessible, so not surprising that we would see substance abuse cropping up. It lowers your inhibition. It makes it so you're less likely to make good decisions and engage in behavior that could be quite detrimental. In many cases, it's closely related to other things like some of the personality disorders. For example, people with antisocial personality disorder are much more likely to engage in substance abuse just as kind of, a way of life. And so some of these things are closely related and more closely related than you might think that they are sometimes. Number five, isolated or lonely. We find this pops up regularly, that these people are often loners. And they're often loners not just when they, for example, if we're looking at a serial killer, when they do the killing, because they're not letting everybody else know they're doing the killing, but they often have a long history of feeling isolated and alone. Loneliness has been shown to be one of the biggest problems that we're having today, as that people feel lonelier and lonelier. And we notice as you feel lonelier and lonelier, you reach out. Unfortunately, things like the internet have been shown it's easy to reach out and get the same group of people. And if we go back to that social climate that we were talking about before, you can actually set your own social climate by just being within certain groups online that then reinforce that. Unfortunately, a lot of those people feel very, very lonely. They don't feel like they fit in very well. And if you're isolated and alone, then you often want to be seen, want to be noticed, want to be important in some way. And so you want to belong. And it seems kind of odd for a lot of people to say, why would you engage in evil behavior to belong? But oftentimes that becomes a lashing out and saying, if I don't belong and you don't let me belong, even if you don't let me belong, because again, sometimes, it's the evildoers' behavior that makes it so that people want to isolate them at times, but still, then they will often lash out. So we see this pretty common, and pretty commonly, even when they are very young. So this is seldom something that just all of a sudden crops up. They've been doing great and they're 25, 30, and then all of a sudden they get lonely. It can, but typically what we see is a longer pattern of this loneliness and isolation. Number four, lack of empathy or remorse. Okay. Now the key here is you've got a couple different kinds of empathy, and this is going to be really important to consider. You've got what's called cold empathy and hot empathy. Cold empathy, a lot of times these people have cold empathy. Cold empathy is the cognitive understanding about what people are doing and why they're doing things. Warm or hot empathy is the emotional understanding. You recognize why that people are feeling that way, and you may actually feel that yourself. That's what's lacking in these people, is this lack of this warm, or sometimes it's called hot empathy, meaning that I emotionally feel for you. So if you're crying and sad, and I have empathy for you, I feel the sadness. I understand what the sadness is, and I can emotionally get that. Okay. What we find is that evildoers often don't get that. They sometimes, especially among those who are more psychopathic, they may go, "Oh, you're crying. I know that that crying makes you vulnerable, and I can take advantage of you because you're vulnerable." So that's that cold or that cool empathy that you have. In other words, I have that cognitive understanding of it. I don't feel it. I don't really care about it. It doesn't bother me that you're crying and upset, or that you're depressed, or that you're nervous. I don't care about that, except that I know that you're more vulnerable then, so I can take advantage of you. So this lack of empathy here is that lack of the warm or the hot empathy, that really emotionally understanding how somebody is, and being affected by it, being impacted by it. So in other words, it doesn't bother you to con somebody out of their money. In fact, your thoughts are, well, if I could con you, you deserved it because I was able to take it from you. Okay. Or if you died, well, that was your fault. In fact, I remember one time I used to do death or evaluations at one point in my life. And I remember one of the guys on death row told me one time that the woman that he killed, it was her fault. And the reason that it was her fault is because he told her to shut up. And if she didn't shut up, he would have to kill her. And she kept screaming. And so he killed her. And he said it was clearly her fault. Okay. So no emotional understanding of that. That's this lack of empathy. And of course, going along with that is that lack of remorse, meaning they don't feel bad about what they did. Going back to this exact same guy that I'm telling you about, he was like, I asked him if he felt bad about it, and he was like, why should I? And I said, well, you dated this woman for 2 years. Did that make any difference? And he said, no, why should that make any difference? In other words, there was no empathy and there was no remorse. It didn't bother him that he did something that he shouldn't do, right? And keep in mind, there's a difference between guilt and remorse. Guilt meaning I did something I shouldn't do and I feel bad about it and I want to, let you know that I'm, letting you know that that's bad. Remorse is kind of a deeper kind of a thing. If I really understand that this is really, I have really violated your trust, your rights, your whatever, those kinds of things. And they just simply don't have that. So they don't have guilt either. They don't have guilt or remorse. Number three, narcissism. I told you before this was going to pop up, and here it is again. The reason is that sense of grandiosity, that sense of I'm special, I'm better than you are. You should grovel before me. You should recognize that I'm wonderful. Also, along with narcissism, is that lack of empathy. They typically don't, because it's about them, and that means if you're feeling sad, they don't really understand it because it's all about them and their importance, and they think that you want to be them, you think that they're fabulous, and if you don't, they either are brittle and are all over you and going, well, why don't you understand how wonderful I am? Or they're like dismissive, like, well, you're too stupid to understand how fabulous that I actually am. This goes to evil because what we find is that evil is much more likely in situations where the person is focusing on themselves and what is it that I want, not what is it that's going to be good for other people, what is it that's going to be good for society. It's what I want. And sometimes what I want, if I'm a narcissist, is for lots of attention and I want you to notice me, which is pretty common. So occasionally they'll seem like they're doing good things because they will do something so that they can get your accolades back. Don't you notice how great I am? But they're really more interested in the accolades than they are in actually whatever it is that they did that was good because it's more about them. So as a result, it's real easy for them then to do the wrong thing because they are busy focused on what is it that I want and what do I want now in the moment. If it happens to be what you want or what's good for, my community, that's great. Because then I get more accolades and everybody pats me on the back. But I just assume throw that aside if there's something else that I want that meets my personal needs, because it always comes back to that. So that's why this is number three. There have been some years, by the way, over the last 6 years that we've been doing this, that narcissism comes out number one. Number two, unstable family of origin. This is really, it's always in the top five. It's never not been in the top five every semester that we've done this and looked at our evildoers. In other words, if you have an unstable family, so this is divorce. It's often really unstable in people who are the most evil in terms of those who are, abusing other people, killing other people, those kinds of things. They have come from a household where there may have been divorce, but there's oftentimes where, no parent around for a long periods of time. They're in and out a lot. There's lots of different people that kind of go in, people getting married and remarried over and over again. People are absent for long periods of time. Often times dads are absent for long periods of time. So you have a single mom working really hard, but there's nobody else there to provide that support that they have. So it goes along with one of the ones that we mentioned before, which had to do with parents are not there and not kind of helping out, not being true parents. In this case, we're talking about a lot more instability with the parents, where they're literally physically gone in many cases, or they're inconsistent when they're around. So you see a lot of that. It doesn't mean, for example, that everybody who gets divorced is going to have an evil child. What it means is those kind of things, the better those are handled, the better the likelihood of the good outcomes. But in these cases, for most of these evildoers, it was not well handled, and so that they end up not having much of a stable, consistent family that they could count on. Plays a huge role as making sure that you have somebody there who really loves you, cares for you, and is willing to spend the time with you, the time and effort that's necessary, even when other things around them are going poorly. But again, the better it is, where more family members are there and supportive of each other, the better it is for long-term outcomes. Now, number one, we'll do the big drum roll. And what are we looking at here? Child abuse. Again, another one that comes out as number one all the time, consistently throughout the semesters, is child abuse. It's kind of like these top three kind of rotate every semester as to which one is the top reason that people are become evil. Being abused, and this can be physically abused, this can be sexually abused, it can be emotionally abused. Most of these people who become most evil have a variety of different types of child abuse that on them. Okay, so they're regularly beaten, they're regularly abused in some way, because this sets you up to where now the world is dangerous. Other people are dangerous. And if other people are dangerous, then I have to be on guard and I'm likely to lash out more quickly on others. So we see that crops up regularly in everything that we see when we look at evildoers. And a lot of times what happens is that people who have been abused as they're young, not only do they learn that adults are not trustworthy and adults are evil because they've been beating them, then they recapitulate and they become that same thing when they get a little bit older. So there's our top 10, the top 10 issues with evildoers out there. And you'll notice that the more that they have of each one of these, the more likely that it is that they are going to engage in some sort of evil behavior.